Hello everyone, welcome to my music theory lesson. This is lesson 12.2, Pivot Chord Modulation. In today's lesson we are going to learn how to write a chord progression that modulates using a pivot chord modulation. To modulate means to change from one key to another. A modulating chord progression is one that starts in a key and ends in a different key. There are three parts to a modulating chord progression. The first part is the establishment of the original key. This tells the listener what key the chord progression is originally in. It is a chord progression that ends with an authentic or deceptive cadence in the original key. The second part, the modulation, is the transition between the two keys. There are many types of modulations. The last part is the establishment of the new key, which tells the listener what the chord progression is now in the new key. This part is a chord progression in the new key that ends with an authentic or deceptive cadence. This example shows the three parts of a modulating chord progression. This progression modulates from D major to G major. The establishment of the original key in the blue rectangle is from the beginning of the first beat to the second measure. The progression is 1, 4, 6, 2, 5, 1 in D major, ending with a perfect authentic cadence. The modulation in red is from the second beat of the second measure to the first beat of the third measure. It is a pivot chord modulation from D major to G major. The last part, the establishment of the new key, is in the green rectangle. It starts on the second beat of the third measure and goes until the end. The progression is 4, 6, 2, 5, 1, 5, 1 in G major, ending with a perfect authentic cadence. The types of modulation are the pivot chord or common chord modulation, enharmonic modulation, direct modulation or phrase modulation, chromatic modulation, sequential modulation, and circle or chain modulation. In this lesson, we are going to learn about pivot chord modulations only. A pivot chord modulation only works with closely related keys. To write a pivot chord modulation, you first need to choose a chord that is diatonic to both keys, called the pivot chord. Then write a progression in the original key that ends with the pivot chord. Starting there, move from the pivot chord to the tonic in the new key. In this example, the pivot chord modulation is from the second beat of the second measure to the first beat of the third measure. The pivot chord is a D major triad, which is 1 in D major and 5 in G major. In D major, the progression moving to the pivot chord is 5-1. Then the pivot chord has to move to the 1 chord in G major. The pivot chord, which is 5, goes to 5-7 and then to 1. The Roman numeral analysis of the first chord that belongs in a certain key is the name of the key, a colon, and then the Roman numeral symbol of the chord. The name of the key is represented as the tonic note with the letter name in capital letters for major keys and lowercase for minor keys. For chords that belong to both keys, put the analysis for the new key below the analysis for the original key. The first chord in D major is analyzed as capital D, colon, 1. The tonic of D major is D and the key is major, so the name of the key is represented as capital D. The Roman numeral for the chord is 1. The first chord belonging to G major is the third chord in the second measure and is analyzed as capital G, colon, 5. The tonic of G major is G and the key is major, so the name of the key is represented as capital G. That chord also belongs to D major, so the Roman numeral analysis for the new key, G major, is written below the analysis for the original key, D major. You need to learn the process of writing a modulating chord progression and how to write a pivot chord modulation, and the best way is by practicing. Let's try it on the next slide. Write a chord progression modulating from B major to C sharp minor using a pivot chord modulation. Sample answer shown. The establishment of the original key 1-6-6-4-5-7-1 in B major is from the beginning to the first beat of the second measure, ending with a perfect authentic cadence in B major. The modulation is a pivot chord modulation, and the pivot chord is an E major triad, which is 4 in B major and 3 in C sharp minor. The modulation lasts from the second beat of the second measure to the third beat of the third measure, moving from the 1 chord of the old key to the pivot chord, and then moving from the pivot chord to 1 in the new key. The establishment of the new key is from the third beat of the third measure to the end, ending in an imperfect authentic cadence in C sharp minor. Write a chord progression modulating from E major to C sharp minor using a pivot chord modulation. Sample answer shown. The establishment of the old key is from the beginning to the first beat of the second measure, ending with a perfect authentic cadence in E major. The modulation is the second measure. The pivot chord used is an F sharp minor triad, which is 2 in E major and 4 in C sharp minor. The establishment of the new key is the last 2 measures, ending with a perfect authentic cadence in C sharp minor. Conclusion. In this lesson, we learned the meaning of modulation, how to write a modulating chord progression, and that a pivot chord modulation is a modulation using a pivot chord diatonic to both keys. For more practice, please download my Music Theory app. In the next lesson, we are going to talk about inharmonic modulations. See you next time!